Matthew chapter 17. Matthew chapter 17. Read the first 14 verses. And after 6 days Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, and bringeth them up unto a high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them. His face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias, talking with him. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If thou wilt let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, one for Elias. While he yet spake, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud which said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their face and were sore afraid. And Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise, be not afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no man save Jesus only. And as they came down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, saying, Tell the vision to no man, until the Son of Man be risen again from the dead. And his disciples asked him, saying, Why then say the scribes that Elias must first come? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Elias truly shall first come and restore all things. But I say unto you that Elias is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise shall also the Son of Man suffer of them. Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. And when they were come to the multitude, there came to him a certain man, kneeling down to him and saying, and then we'll just stop there. What we read here is recorded by Mark, in Mark chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, and also by Luke, in Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through verse 36. It is really the record of one of the most remarkable, extraordinary, momentous events in the earthly ministry of Christ. And it is referred to as the transfiguration of Christ. We read in verse 2 that Jesus was transfigured before them. Now, transfiguration is a change in form and substance. And it's important to realize that what we read here is not a change in who and what Jesus is, but it was a change in the appearance or the form of Jesus Christ. And I believe that most of God's people greatly undervalue this event of transfiguration. And while God's people believe that it happened, and may even believe that it's significant, most don't seem to know what to do with it or how to apply it to their own lives. Again, what we read here is something truly remarkable, something extraordinary and marvelous. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean to us? And though you and I do not experience this as Peter, James, and John did that day, there is a sense in which we do and can have such an experience In fact, I believe it ought to be a daily experience. So what we read here is very instructive, and it certainly applies to our lives. In verse 1, we read that Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John, and bringeth them into a high mountain apart, that is separate and apart from all else, which gives people today a stroke. Mark chapter 9, verse 2, Jesus taketh with him Peter, James, and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart. There it is again, by themselves. So there they are, these three. They are apart with Jesus Christ. What is recorded in our text tells us what happened upon that mountain, tells us their experience with Christ upon that mountain. And then we read in Matthew 17, verse 9, and as they, that's Peter, James, and John, came down from the mountain. And we read in Mark 9, verse 9, and as they came down from the mountain, and in Luke 9:37, when they were come down. Now, when they came down, they were immediately faced with everyday life. Immediately. And that's our subject. Apart with Jesus into the everyday scenes of life with Him. We have to get apart with Him, and then we go into everyday life with Him. That's how we're to live. That's how we're to live. So consider the context of the Transfiguration, because it's important. The context goes back to Matthew 16, verses 13 through verse 28. And it was there that Jesus and the apostles arrive in the coast of Caesarea Philippi. And it was there that Jesus began the process of showing the apostles that He would suffer at the hands of men, and that He would die, and that He would rise again victoriously. He's telling these disciples, they're back in Matthew 16, we don't have time to go there, but He's telling them an extremely difficult, trying, demanding time is on the horizon for you. He's trying to prepare them. In light of this, Jesus explained to them what they needed in preparation for this coming time. He's telling them what was necessary for them to endure the coming events, and what was necessary for them to bring glory to Him in spite of the coming events. And He begins by telling them that they needed, first of all, to have a proper perception of who He was. He said, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they answered. And all their answers would not have, some say you're Jeremiah, some say you're one of the prophets. None of those answers have any impact upon a life. But then He said, "Whom do ye say that I am?" And Peter, of course, gave the right answer, and then Jesus said, "Flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee." So He's telling them, He begins it all by saying you need to have a proper perception of who I am. You need to know who I am. They needed something more than speculation. Whom do men say that I am? And they speculated. They needed something more than conjecture concerning Christ. What they needed was to have a personal assurance and a conviction and a realization of who and what Christ really is. They had to have that. That's greatly lacking today in so-called Christendom. They needed a life-changing knowledge and perception of Jesus Christ. That's what he's telling them back in Matthew 16. Jesus went on to reveal to them that they needed a personal realization of their unworthiness and their insufficiency and how they needed the grace of God in their lives. He revealed to them that they needed personal conviction, that Christ's work cannot be thwarted. He also revealed to them that their will must be fully engaged to follow Him. In other words, they must have a desire, they must have a yearning, they must have a resolve and an eagerness and an enthusiasm for Christ. And that would proceed from a right perception of Jesus Christ. If you have a right perception of Christ, then you will have a desire for Christ, and you will have a resolve and a yearning for Christ. So he's telling them that he also goes on and he tells them that there must be a single-mindedness. There must be a firmness of purpose concerning Jesus Christ. And this must be stronger than any other desire that they might have. So it's a desire that takes priority. A desire for Christ that takes priority over all the events of life and over all other relationships in life. He revealed to them that day that there must be an attraction for Christ. He said, follow me. You must have an attraction for Him. And you will. It all begins with a right perception of Christ. And he tells them that their hearts and minds must be obsessed with Him. And they must be pulled and drawn toward Him. And again, all those things will happen automatically if there is a right perception of who He is. He revealed to them that day that there must be self-denial. No problem denying self if you know who Christ is. That they must refuse. They must turn down, they must renounce, they must reject self. So he's telling them that their lives must be given to Him, for Him to mold and shape and train and conform. He revealed to them that day that they must be willing to be hated, to be mocked, to be rejected, to be thought the scum of the earth, in order that they go all the way with Jesus Christ. So overall, that day, back in Matthew 16, He told them that life was to be lived serving Him, separated to Him, that He was to have the preeminence in all things, that He was to be the priority, that He was to be the emphasis, the purpose, the goal, and the passion of their life. That their lives were to be fully committed to Him, and they were to live leaning and depending upon Him and following Him. Jesus had told them that day unexpected things. It's not what they wanted to hear. I'm going to die. I'm going to suffer at the hands of men. And then after he tells them these things, he laid their duty before them. So the text, Matthew 17, opens with, after 6 days. After 6 days of what happened in Matthew 16. Mark concurs, but Luke writes in Luke 8 verse 28, and it came to pass about 8 days after. It's not a contradiction. It's a matter of perception. Matthew and Mark are speaking of the days between the two events. What transpired in Matthew 16, what transpires here in Matthew 17. Luke, no doubt, included also the days of the two events. So you have 8 days. Again, it's a matter of perception. For 6 days between these two events, there's 6 days between the two events. You count the two events, you have 8 days. But between the two events, there are 6 days. And I am sure that the apostles reflected upon and gave much thought to what Jesus had said to them. And I believe they were thinking about it for those 6 days. And I'm sure that during those 6 days, they discussed amongst themselves what Jesus had told them was going to happen, and his instruction to them. And I'm sure that there were some lingering questions. For 6 days, they were trying to fit what Jesus had said into their understanding. It's not what they were expecting. And trying to relate what he had said to their lives. Again, read verse 1. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, and bringeth them up to a high mountain apart. And then read verse 9. And as they came down from that mountain, what happens between those two statements, verse 1 and verse 9, is what is recorded in verses 2 through 8. And is what we need to be and live. What Christ presented them to them. It's what we need. If we're going to be what Christ presented to them 6 days before, this is what we need. Verses 2 through 8. Got to have it. So we want to look at what transpired and then the application to ourselves. Again, what we read here is an actual event, a historical event, but we must not merely view it as an historical event, because by this event, we are being taught very valuable and relevant spiritual lessons. Again, many, they don't deny the transfiguration, but they don't know what to do with it. And it's very significant. And it's very important that we have an understanding. This is what we need. There is a sense in which we are privileged and have the opportunity to experience what is spoken of here. Not to the same degree of Peter, James, and John. And we must experience it if we're going to be what we need to be. Have to. You can't be what you need to be apart from this, apart from the lessons that we learn here. So we see, first of all, There was a special time and place that they spent with Jesus Christ. Special time. A special place. Again, in each account, Peter, James, and John are apart with Jesus. People today don't even know the meaning of the word apart. But they were apart with Jesus. They had no idea what was going on down below that mountain. Well, I got to know. No, you don't. They didn't even care to know what was going on down below. Well, what if there's an emergency? You going to interrupt your time with Jesus for that? Is that what you're going to do? They're apart with Jesus. This is everything. In verse 1, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John. In Mark 9, verse 2, Jesus taketh with him Peter, James, and John. Luke 9:28, he took Peter, James, and John. Again, in Matthew 17:1, they're apart. He took them apart from everything else. We need that. We've got to have that if we're going to be what we need to be. Jesus took them from the everyday routine to Himself. To Himself. It is Jesus associating with them in a way of very special relationship apart from everything else. Next we read in verse 1 of our text, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart. Mark uses the word leadeth. He took, he brought, he led them. And the purpose was to do them good. I believe the Lord still does the same thing. They were now under His power. He took them. He led them. They were under His power and guiding influence. And under His power and guiding influence, where did they end up? Apart with Jesus. Apart with Jesus. That's where He led them. Mark 9, verse 8, it is Jesus only with themselves. Jesus only with themselves. Then you have the Transfiguration. In Luke's account, we are told that Jesus went up into the mountain to pray. That's why He went up into the mountain. One of the reasons. And as Jesus is praying, in Luke 9, verse 32, but Peter and they that were with him, that would be James and John, were heavy with sleep. They fell asleep. It was while Jesus was praying. Notice in Luke 9, keep a mark there in Matthew 17, but in Luke 9, verse 29, and as he prayed, so he's praying, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment was white and glistering. So, while he's praying, while he's praying, he was transfigured. Moses, the giver of the law, Elijah, the greatest of all the prophets, appeared and talked with Jesus. We see that in Luke 9, verses 30 and 31. So there's Moses and Elijah, and they're talking with Jesus. Keep in mind that while all this is going on, Peter, James, and John, it says, were heavy with sleep. There was an awakening. Sometime while this was going on, Peter, James, and John awoke. Notice verse 32 of Luke chapter 9. But Peter and they that were with him were heavy with sleep, and when they were awake, they saw his glory and the two men that stood with him. So they are stirred from their sleep. They become conscious, very aware. And they see Jesus, and they see Moses and Elijah. Every day, we need to be apart with Jesus, and we need to be stirred and made aware. Stirred and made aware. That's what happened. Next, they personally saw. They awake. They see Jesus, but not the same way before they went to sleep. Notice verse 32 again of Luke chapter 9. They saw his glory and the two men that stood with him. So they fall asleep while he's praying. They are awakened. While Jesus is praying, Moses and Elijah appear. They're conversing with Jesus. Peter, James, and John are awakened, and they saw his glory. Apart with Jesus, their eyes are opened. And they see the magnificence. And they see the splendor and the majesty and the beauty and the elegance of his person. They saw his glory. There was an uncovering of who he was. Now, how this took place is explained in Luke 9, verse 29. The fashion of his countenance was altered. Matthew describes it in Matthew 17, verse 2. His face did shine as the sun. God in his magnificence, God in his splendor and his majesty, shone through his face. And his face glowed with his own inner glory. Matthew says, Matthew 17:2, his raiment was white as the light. It's blinding. Notice what Mark said of his raiment. Mark chapter 9, verse 3. And his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can white them. They saw this. Luke, again, chapter 9, verse 29, and as he prayed, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment was white as the glistering. The rays of his magnificence the rays of who He is burst through his clothes. In addition to seeing this, Peter, James, and John also saw Moses and Elijah. Matthew 17, verse 3, and behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias, talking with him. Peter's response, Matthew 17, verse 4, Lord, it's good for us to be here. Yes, it is, Peter. Yes, it is. Peter's thought process was, we don't ever want to leave here. But life has to go on. But where was it that they experienced this? Apart with Jesus. So He's transfigured. Next, they felt and they experienced an overshadowing presence. While Peter was speaking in Matthew 17:4, we read in verse 5, while he yet spake, so as he's speaking, behold, attention getting word, a bright cloud overshadowed them. So they see His glory, and now there's this bright cloud, and it's overshadowing them. This isn't an ordinary cloud. This is a bright cloud. And behold, a voice out of the cloud, which said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye Him. Notice it's not just hear Him. That would be speaking to them collectively, Peter, James, and John. But He said, hear ye Him. That is, Peter, hear Him. James, hear Him. John, hear Him. Hear ye Him. So there they are, apart with Jesus. A bright cloud, extraordinary cloud, overshadowed, or it concealed them. And apart with Jesus, they experienced this special covering. And every day, we need to get apart with Jesus until we feel His special overshadowing presence. We need that every day. Every day. They heard the voice of God. It was a very clear voice. It was distinct. It was powerful. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye Him. So it was apart with Jesus that they heard God speak. Now, we're not going to hear Him in an audible voice, but we ought to hear Him every day as if it were an audible voice. People will say, you won't believe this, but it was just like an audible voice. Oh, I believe it. You don't have to convince me. I believe it. It's not that we're saying we heard an audible voice, but might as well have. That's how clear. That's how plain it was. We need that. God's people go through their whole life never experiencing that. We need to experience it every day if we're going to be what we need to be. Notice the effect that this had upon them. And when the disciples heard it, the voice, they fell on their face and were sore afraid. Well, how do you know when you hear it? Right there. You'll know it by the result, by the effect it has. They fell on their face and they were sore afraid. It brings them to a reverential position. So apart with Jesus, they hear this voice that has a powerful impact upon them. We need to experience, we need to get apart every day and experience this. People say, well, I don't have time. You don't realize the importance. Anybody that says that is ignorant of the importance of what we're talking about. You'll make time for whatever you want to do. And you need to make time to get apart with Jesus and hear the voice of God in such a way that it brings you to a place of humble submission. That's what verse 6 is all about. It's a place of humble submission. Then, verse 7, and Jesus came and touched them. So there they are, lying on the ground. Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise, be not afraid." Lying on the ground, their souls were aroused. They were transformed. Every day, we need to get apart with Jesus and feel His transforming touch every day. No better way to start a day. Verse 8, they were brought to the realization that Jesus is all. And when they lifted up their eyes, so remember, when they woke from their sleep, they saw Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Cloud overshadows them. God speaks. The result of that was they fell on their faces. And then Jesus comes, touches them, tells them, "Arise." And when they arise, they look up. They saw no man. That is, Moses and Elijah were no longer there. Jesus only. And now He's clothed with His humanity. They have seen His glory. But now He's clothed with His humanity. And they saw Jesus only. That needs to be a daily experience. We need to be brought to a place where the only thing we see is Him. Need that every day. Without it, we're not going to be what we ought to be. So what a lesson we have here for you and I. Apart with Jesus, there was awakening. There was a seeing the glory of Christ. There was a feeling of God's special overshadowing presence. A personal hearing of the voice of God. And a feeling of the touch of Christ, bringing them to the realization that Jesus is everything. We need that individually every day. That should happen every single worship service to every single individual. Every single individual, as we worship, we're together in the room, but every single individual ought to be apart with Jesus and experience these things. And I don't believe it's worship unless that happens. We need to be apart with Him. Get rid of all the excuses. Because as soon as we say that, people's mind starts going, well, I can't do that, can't do, and on they go. They'll have a list of 200 things why they can't. And you'll never be what you ought to be for the Lord. Get rid of the excuses and realize the importance of being apart with Jesus. Then notice verse 9. And as they came down, now it's obvious that Jesus is included in the they from the very next words. Jesus charged them. As they came down, Jesus charged them. So they are now coming down the mountain, heading into everyday life, but they're doing so with Him. They're doing so with Him. Notice, Jesus did not send them down the mountain, but He comes down the mountain with them. That wouldn't have happened had they not gone up into the mountain with Him apart. So this is the result of being apart with Jesus. They now come down with Him. That's how you face a new day. Don't anyone say that, well, there's a better way. There is no better way to face a new day than to get apart with Jesus and go out there with Him. No better way to live. And I believe that can be our life every single day. And then in verse 14, well, as they come down, they understood that Jesus was speaking of John the Baptist. And then verse 14, and when they were come to the multitude, so now they're no longer apart. Their apart time has prepared them for everyday life. They come to the multitude. There came to him, Jesus, a certain man, kneeling down to him, saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he's a lunatic and sore vexed, for oftentimes he falleth in the fire and often in the water. And I brought him to the disciples, and they could not cure him. So immediately, they are faced with everyday situations. But they're with Him. Everyday situations must be dealt with, must be faced. You can do it by yourself, or you can do it with Him. Quite a difference between the two. So there they are with the everyday situation. But because they were apart with Jesus, they have something to hold on to. And something has got a hold of them. We can take our apart with Jesus time into everyday life. Has to happen. Has to. We can take the revelation of our part with Jesus time. And if we get apart with Him, things will be revealed. And we can take that revelation into everyday life. we can take what we learn in our part with Jesus time into everyday life. It is our part with Jesus time. That's where we find renewal. Well, I'm going to start doing better. Well, you keep telling yourself that. It won't happen unless you get a part with Him. It's the only way it's happening. It's a part with Him that we find renewal. Well, I just need to get away on a vacation to recharge spiritually. No, that's not what you need. You need to get apart with Him. With Him. That's where we find awakening. That's where we find stirring. That's what invigorates us. That's where we find enablement to face the trials and the distresses and the difficulties and the obstacles and the battles and the struggles and the burdens and the sorrows and the heartaches. It is a part with Him. That's where we find the strength that we need. It's where we find the assurance that we need. It's where we find the confidence that we need. Oh, that God's people would come to the realization of the importance of a part with Jesus time. That's what we need. That's our greatest need. It's our greatest need. It fixes everything. It changes attitudes. You can't be apart with Him and develop a bad attitude. It's not possible. It changes everything. It changes our perception. It changes everything about us. We need to see the importance of getting apart with Him. We can't stay there. There's life to be lived. But the life that is to be lived is not to keep you from a part-time with Jesus. But you take time with Jesus apart so that you can live everyday life. That's how it's done. There's no 20-step program. Nothing difficult to understand. The problem is, even God's people don't want to be apart with Jesus. Someone says, "Oh, you shouldn't say that. That's well, all you got to do is look around. The evidence is obvious. Very, very, very few spend part-time with Jesus. We have to. There's no other way. And the sooner we realize that and just forget all the excuses, the sooner we come to that realization, that's when we'll get truly serious about serving the Lord, and that's when we'll truly want Him to be everything. We have to have it. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us